If the committee would please come to order. Welcome to your first day of in-person corporations. Before I turn it over, just letting you all know, we're going to start with House Bill 65, political subdivision deposits today. With that committee, I'm super pleased to introduce the newest legislative committee secretary, Barb Austin. And this is an upgrade from a clerical assistant last year to being a committee secretary. I like to think she got as lucky as any committee secretary can be getting corporations committee. We're all returners, no freshmen, so we're going to move a little fast, but if any time you need me to reiterate an amendment or explain, just certainly let me know, Ms. Austin. With that, if you would call the roll, and then I will turn it over to you for opening announcements in the secretarial world.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Blackburn, Representative Clausen, Representative Clifford.
She's currently excused, but may be joining us via Zoom here in a bit.
Okay. Representative Duncan, Representative Ayer, Representative Hunt, Representative McGuire, Representative Roscoe, Chairman Zwanitzer.
I think that's 8 here, 1 excused. And then Ms. Austin, did you have some
Thank you.
opening announcements for the committee?
Okay, this is just a little bit of housekeeping. In your folders, you'll see a contact information sheet. If you could fill that out, you can just leave it in your folder and I will pick it up later. That's fine, or you can hand it to me. Coffee is in the back room along with snacks and water. There's also a water machine back there if you aren't aware of that. And your statutes are located in this room on a little bookshelf, but I'm going to close the door because it kind of hums. Okay, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, committee, no opening announcements or questions. It's good seeing you all in person. I had Judiciary Committee this morning where we actually delineated about half the amount of space, and we're like all 9 of us are crowded. So hopefully you all enjoy your space to move around and stretch your arms. We are going to start with House Bill 65 first today, political subdivisions deposits. Certainly an old friend of mine and also an old friend of mine, while still relatively young. Please welcome Representative Larson Lloyd to present House Bill 65.
For me, Mr. Oh, there, I got the green light. Mr. Chairman, are you ready?
Certainly are.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, as Chairman Zwanitzer suggested, and for some of you that I'm looking to see, probably none of you were here when I ran this bill in 2014 or 2015. And the origin of this bill really comes from my part of the world. And at the time, there were 2 communities in the state, Wright, Wyoming, and Shoshone, Wyoming, that does not have a bank in the community. And so then the public funds that are gathered have to be, Shoshone has to take them to Riverton to be deposited into the bank there. And so they had come to me and said, boy, could we get something that will allow us to deposit the banks in a credit union, because there's a credit union that has an office in Shoshone. I thought I thought the request was simple, and I didn't, have a sense of why there would be a problem in doing such a thing. And so I drafted a bill, and in doing so found out that there was some concern between the banking institutions around the state and credit unions. I have never used a credit union. I've always used a bank and was just pretty ignorant on the matter. But and I'll go into the history of that because it really comes back to an interpretation of the Constitution, Article 15, Section 7, which says that all money belonging to a state or any county, city, or town shall, whenever practicable, which is key, whenever practicable, be deposited in a national bank or banks, or in a bank or banks incorporated under law of this state. So what we drafted back then is a bill really similar to this, as I reached out to the community, and then I reached out to the Attorney General to understand, and he provided an AG opinion on why a credit union couldn't be used, but or if it could be. And the response from that AG opinion was, it could be, but you'd have to go in and change, as we are doing here in 94803 and 817. And what we say here, and as you look on page 2, is that on line 8, with respects to deposit of state funds, bank includes, and then we come down to line 12 and we use, as used in the statute 94801 through 94818, with respect to deposits of funds, a political subdivision, bank or banks means incorporated under the law, Wyoming National Bank Savings and Loan Institutions incorporated under the law, federal savings loans, federal savings bank when practical, or a bank that is not available. And this is kind of language we put in there, or when a bank is not available within 10 miles radius of a principal place of business of the political subdivision, an institution approved by the Board of Deposits, which was some language that was crafted that first time that said, if there's not a bank within 10 miles of that municipality, they could deposit in an institution approved by the Board of Deposits, in which a credit union qualifies. Okay. So that was the intent of the bill. And that 10-mile radius was kind of a compromise at that time with our some colleagues on the floor who had some strong banking interests, and they says, driving 10 miles isn't a big deal, and I agreed with that. And so since that time, the city of Wright has now got a bank, if I understand that correctly. The mayor of Shoshone reached out to me this year and says, could we please try that again? It's just a pain in the neck that when we have cash that I have to send my people to Riverton to make a deposit. Now, most banking, except for me, probably most people do that online, and I get that, but there's yet a component of that when there's cash or whenever that you have to do something separately. And so they would like the ability to do that with a financial institution that exists in their community, which happens to be a credit union. So, Mr. Chairman, if you'll allow me, I think, as you are well aware, I need to kind of go back and help you understand a little bit of the historic perspective of this, because I think it just helps you better understand that when in that AG opinion, reflecting back on the Constitution, where it says whenever practicable becomes the key language on when public funds should be in a national bank or banks incorporated in the state. And in that AG opinion, they go through and they tell you what a national state bank are, which are for-profit commercial entities that issue capital stock. And then they go in and talk about savings and loans, which are mutual thrift institutions, and then credit unions, which and savings and loans are governed by a democracy. They vote on it, and credit unions are nonprofit, tax exempt, democratically controlled institutions, somewhat like savings and loans. And so then they go in and they talk about that article in Article 15 only requires public funds to be deposited within a national or state banks whenever practicable. And then it talks about how in 1977, that we readjusted the banking laws for public funds to accommodate savings and loans. So we moved and brought them into that, but have not done so regarding not regarding credit unions. There was a at the same time we were doing this, as a result of this Attorney General's opinion, we found out that there were public funds being held in non-state or national banks functioning in the state. So other state banks, not national banks, but banks organized in other states, not a state bank in Wyoming, that were holding public funds. And that kind of raised some eyebrows. And so then the next year we had a bill, and we had an LSO memo in August by our LSO staff talking about the need to come back in and correct that point if we were going to allow cities and towns or political subdivisions to park public funds in these non-state banks. And so we'd done that in 2016 with House Bill 28. And so we amended that. We've kind of amended how we can do that within the realm of the definition of banks. But we've still said, hands off. If you're a credit union, you can't accept public funds for whatever reason. Okay. They're governed, they're secure, they're recognized by the board of directors. And this bill would then allow in my part of the world, a small municipality to park their public funds in an institution or in a that's recognized, that's not a bank, that's accepted by the board, and it's not within 10 miles, and they're not within 10 miles of a bank incorporated under the laws of Wyoming. So that, in a nutshell, Mr. Chairman, is the bill and a little bit of the history behind it. I would just, again, I giggle because I was just naive to the banking world when I run this first bill, and holy smokes, I didn't realize that there was the feelings that existed, and I do now, but I don't think that takes away from the intent of the bill, which is really, we're trying to make it hard for this community just because, or would the public funds be held safe? Yes. Would it be a benefit to the community? Yes. I don't see the harm. Now, I will tell you that what I heard last time, well, you're just wanting to let, you're wanting the ability for credit unions to anywhere hold public funds. That isn't the argument here today. Okay. And that was the reason this language for within a 10-mile radius come into this bill last time, as we were just saying, please, can we just let Shoshone or any other small municipality do this? And so that's what the bill is, Mr. Chairman, and I would be happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Committee, are there any questions for Representative Larson? I am not seeing, yep, Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Larson, in the memory of someone who's no longer with us, should we amend this bill to include a restriction that only institutions that are displaying the bucking horse and using blockchain to track their cryptocurrency deposits be allowed to handle these deposits?
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, it'd probably be more appropriate to have some sleeping elk.
Further questions, committee, Representative Larson? Seeing none at this time. Oh, you do have one, Representative Bear, go ahead.
I should know this. I know I've been informed on this at one point, but I've lost in my memory. That last line on your new edition on page 2 there on line 19, an institution approved by the board of deposits. You tell me who the Board of Deposits is?
Banking.
Representative Larson, it's
So, Mr. Chairman and Representative Ayers, so on your minerals, and business and all of that, when Mr. Fortner comes, the banking guy, it's that Board of Deposits that oversee institutions that can accept deposits.
Okay, our Division of Banking.
and it is an approved list that they, I think, relook at every 3 or 5 years and make sure that all of the current lists are meeting the right financial guidelines and can handle the funds that are given.
Not a local.
Yeah.
Further questions? Seeing none at this time. Any state agencies here to testify on House Bill 65? Not seeing any on the internet. Any legislators here to testify on 65? Seeing none. Any credit union lobbyists here to testify on 65? Welcome, Mr. Pickard. And if it's okay, Representative Larson, you're welcome to stay there, observing proper protocols. Welcome, Dave. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Dave Pickard. I represent the Mountain West Credit Union Association. And we appreciate Representative Larson and the other sponsors bringing this bill before you. A little bit of additional history. It did come out of the House in 2015 by a significant vote margin. And it died over in the Senate because of lack of time and a little bit of confusion over the mileage circumference in there. Mr. Chairman, we support the legislation. And what I'd like to do is offer up, I believe, Brian Rohrbacher from the Atlantic City Federal Credit Union is available via Zoom. And I also believe that there are some municipalities that should be on Zoom as well. But before you go to them, if there's any questions, I'd stand for those at this time. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Pickard? Representative Duncan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pickard, I know from history of minerals and such, we've had this battle between entities of banking versus credit union. And I still can't wrap my head around why. Is it a turf war? I still don't understand. Can you very briefly try and help me understand?
Go ahead, Mr. Pickard.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, I can try. Let me give you a little quick background. I was a vice president of lending of a federal credit union here in Cheyenne back in the late 80s and early 90s. The public funds issue has been around since the early 1980s, whereby the credit unions really felt that they should be treated equally with their counterparts in the banking industry. Due to the Constitution, that is just not something that's plausible. And we have been through many committee meetings on the issue of public funds. And there just seems to be a reluctance to accept, primarily because of the Constitution really outlining and defining what a financial institution is. And keep in mind, our Constitution was adopted in 1890. The Federal Credit Union Act came into being in 1933 or 1934, right in there. So it wasn't contemplated at all during the early years of statehood. And over the course of time, as Representative Larson mentioned, the financial industry has changed significantly, certainly with the advent of interstate banking. And that was the reference to the bill that was a corrective action bill, I think 3 or 4 years ago, because political subdivisions and the state of Wyoming had funds on deposit that technically were not authorized under the Constitution. So whether I have a really good working relationship with the Wyoming Banking Association and of course the banking division. They do not regulate the credit unions. The credit unions are federally regulated. We do have our own very solvent in CUSIF, which is their backup fund, just like banks have the FDIC. But I would hope that that animosity over the years is diminishing. We're all part of Wyoming. The Wyoming credit unions serve an enormous swath of Wyoming citizens. I think currently around 80,000, 90,000 account owners that reside in Wyoming. So I mean, we are a significant portion of the economy. Again, this bill is not necessarily about public funds. It's really about the safety issue of the town of Shoshone and also the town of Wright. I know that when the bill was run a couple of years ago, the town of Wright did have a authorized depository institution. And I do believe that might not be the case anymore as the economy has changed up there, but they do have a credit union. So in my understanding is this will have a material positive impact on both the town of Shoshone and the town of Wright. I hope that answers your question.
Quick follow-up, Representative Duncan.
Thank you. Quick follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Pickard. So would I be correct in assuming that a lot of the problem is just education for the legislators? Possibly that we just need to educate everyone better besides the constitutional issue, but maybe if our body was more educated about the credit unions, that would be a little easier to push this through, maybe, or Representative Larson?
Oh, I don't think Mr. Pickard wants to answer that if we were smarter here, we would do something different policy-wise. It's a pretty tough place to put him. But if you want to answer that, Mr. Pickard, before I turn it back to Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, I will defer to Representative Larson, but what I will say is the 66th legislature and what we have seen already in the 8-day session and all, I mean, you all are seeking a lot of education, and I would hope that all of my colleagues in the lobby continue to help our citizen legislature understand all of the nuances of the economy of Wyoming. Thank you.
President Larson, do you have anything to throw on there?
So my conclusion to Mr. Chairman, to Representative Duncan's question is kind of reflective of an endeavor that I was assigned after my first legislative session, where we rebased our long-term care facilities. And again, I'm not a long-term, what did I know about them, and was assigned to be part of that at the Department of Health. And when we come into those discussions, what we had long-term care facilities that were for-profit, okay? And on the other side of the room, we had long-term care facilities which were not for profit. And the twain would not come, it was, in fact, it was almost as though we defiled the room to let them both be in there together, because one is for profit and one is for not-profit, and one is purer than the wind-driven snow and the other is not. But at the end of the day, after some long work, they come together and they really done some amazing stuff. We got that done. But from my perspective, which is just a little bit different, what I hear from my banking friends is we are a for-profit. We pay taxes. We have capital stock. This is what we do. And on the other side, your credit unions are not-for-profit. They're kind of owned within itself, and they provide the same services, but there's just this being purer than the wind-driven snow, and I say that with the greatest respect, but there's just a philosophical difference on the structure of the entities that seems, when I talk to them, and I giggle when I do, because I have friends on both sides of that conversation. And so I think your point of helping people as we make these type of decisions to perhaps sometimes look past that conversation to do the greater good for the people that they're serving.
Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pickard, if you would please just send me the citation to where the language is in the Wyoming Constitution that talks about public funds. And also if there's any case law subsequent to that that interprets it, or if there are statutes that have interpreted it, just for my own edification. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I
Mr.
would be
Pickard.
happy to do so. And Representative Larson referenced it in the August 16th, 2016 LSO memo. And I'll make sure that the committee gets a copy of that memo.
Okay. And I could have sent that out to committee. Sorry, I didn't know it'd come up. Representative Roscoe.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pickard I know very little about public deposits and public funds, but I was just wondering if there was a difference in the return on investment or the return on the deposits on the funds between credit unions and the banks we normally use.
Mr. Pickard.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, that is a very good question and one that I appreciate fielding. The deposit rates are set by the Board of Deposits. And so they're equal between any of the institutions.
Further questions for Mr. Pickard? Seeing none at this time. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Mr. Meyer, did you want to testify on this bill? You're just here to listen. You're the next contestant. Welcome to House Bill 65.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Pickard needs to turn his microphone on so that the online participants can hear his testimony.
I'll have Mr. Meyer do that. They apparently think you're someone else right now testifying, Mr. Meyer.
Is
Welcome.
that better?
Yes,
Would you like me to start over?
I think you can continue.
Thank you. With respect to the distance of 10 miles, I mean, that's less than what it is across this great community of Cheyenne. So I look at this and I say, I don't know what 10 miles is and I don't know what the relevance is, other though it just gets you into a certain area where it's pretty arbitrary. It makes sure that we can use these deposits, put our deposits where we want to. And I don't think that the 10-mile really has anything to do with much. As I understand it, and I've visited both the communities that have these, that have the issue where there's no banking right there, but they're fairly close to communities that do. So when I look at it, I say, now, what are you currently doing? Well, a lot of them, as you and I and everybody else probably does, is do a lot of remote deposits, whether it's check readers, whether it's on the phone, what have you. They do a lot of it. The question then seems to come up as to what to do with the cash. Now, the cash is there, but they're already making trips, whatever it is, to whatever community they have to on a weekly basis. And yes, there is a time limit, but apparently they're making that time limit now. So I don't know what has changed other than what now is the question of what is convenient. And I look at this and say, okay, if you're making this deposits by cash, and some of them do, if you go into some of these communities, they go to the city hall, they pay their utility bills, they pay their parking fees, they pay their speeding tickets, they pay everything that has to do with the community. Like I say, majority of that would have to be through checks, but to the extent that they do have cash, I question how much cash we're talking about, and I question how far it is to take it to make that deposit. We've already talked a little bit about the term in the Constitution, but remember that a credit union originally was set up for the purposes of a select employee group. And so you might find like, Scott Meyer Law Office, who has 4 employees, can be a select employee group and go join a credit union and say, my employees are going to do this. That doesn't mean the law firm across the street can do it. They have to become a select employee firm as well.
And the same with all these other businesses. What we're finding now is that these select employee groups keep getting bigger and start covering not only this employer and that employer, which is fine, but also members of the community, members of the county, members of the state. I don't know where you start drawing the line on this, but I'm telling you that the credit union is a little bit different than a bank. You don't see a lot of the community involvement in some of them, although some of them you do, as far as the community reinvestment that banks do. And then there was the issue that was brought up regarding taxation. And credit unions don't pay taxes. Credit unions are a nonprofit. They reinvest that. Your bankers pay taxes. And so the idea that we're going to have taxpayer funds that belong to these communities being deposited in a non-tax paying entity seems like it goes a little bit against the grain. So I look at it and say, if we're going to support the communities and support those entities that support the communities, then that would be your bankers. You can't go to a high school football game and look at the scoreboard without seeing a bank on there. Now, that doesn't mean you won't see a credit union in some places, but almost always you see a bank in there. You see the bank supporting everything in the community. And in fact, with this great pandemic that has just occurred, it was the bankers that stood up and said, we will deal with the PPP. We will stand up for our communities. And in fact, the general idea is that in any community, big or small, in this state, the center of that community is either a church or a bank. And it's the bankers that are doing this. So to come back and now say, well, what we'd like to have is these two small communities, we'd like to carve out an exception and say that as a matter of convenience, we would like to be able to deposit these and go across the street and do that. How much money are we really actually depositing? And I think it becomes really clear at some point in time that while we've talked about what these deposit institutions are, and where they are and what the credit unions are doing, in my humble opinion, it's another example of the proverbial camel sticking its nose under the tent. When they were trying to provide vehicle loans, when they're trying to find ATV loans, all the things you do that, now all of a sudden it got into mortgages, now it's getting into businesses. They do exactly whatever they want to do. In fact, they'd like to say they do banking, although one of the credit unions here in this state says we're not a bank, and that's their logo. But at the same time, that's what they try to do. But it isn't a level playing field. And so when you look at it, you say, okay, how far am I going to do to make sure that at least two communities can walk across the parking lot and deposit funds, or go down the block and deposit funds, being a nominal amount that it is, as opposed to taking it to the bank, which the Constitution requires. And that is why it requires that, is because the banks are the central part of a community. I will tell you that the conversation, at least the comment, was that, you know, this has a material impact. And again, I don't know what a material impact it is on these communities. Material is a slippery slope, just like what is practical. I can't define it. It's going to be changed about no matter how you look at it. And each person that looks at it is going to have their own definition of what is a material impact and a question of what is a practical operation here. We stand totally against this for those very reasons. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, and I'll be happy to provide any education I can as to the difference between the federal credit unions. We don't have state credit unions here, but right now, but federal credit unions and banks.
True. Questions for Mr. Meyer in the Banking Association? Seeing none at this time. Thank you, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there other public comment here in the room on this bill? Wham, huh? Welcome, Mr. Fraser. And then after that, we will take public comment from people watching on the hybrid format. So don't go far, but if you do want to testify on this bill online, please raise your hand and I'll start admitting you into the room. With that though, Mr. Fraser, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it looks like my mic is on. I will be very brief because I believe Representative Larson covered the bill very well. And we have in the waiting room Mayor Highsmith of Shoshone and the Chief of Police of Shoshone, Chris Kojai. So I'll not get in their way very much. They'll be able to explain their situation to you a little better. I would just not only thank Representative Larson for sponsoring the bill, but also thank him for the great way he covered the bill. I do think a couple of quick things. I will admit that if you pass this bill, that will be more convenient for a couple of our cities, but it's not really a convenience issue. It's mostly an efficiency issue. And I think Mayor Highsmith will speak to this. When you've got, when you've got a small staff and you're squeezing, everything you can out of them, they're all wearing a lot of different hats. To have somebody gone out of the office for, nearly a couple hours a day is terribly inefficient. In fact, when you're talking about a community and a staff this small, I wouldn't be surprised if that means if somebody's on vacation, maybe you're closing City Hall for a couple hours while you run to a neighboring community to make your deposits. And so that's important. And of course, whenever you're out on the highway, especially some days in Wyoming, there can be safety issues associated with needing to go and do that, as opposed to walking down the street and making your deposit. So there are some real issues around here. I do think, though banking is not my specialty, I do believe that this bill is written narrowly enough so as not to open any proverbial floodgates, but rather just to focus on the needs of these couple of communities. And frankly, other small communities that might find themselves in the same situation in the future if a credit union opens there. So with that, I will indicate SWAM's support of this bill. I think it's some common sense focused legislation. And with that, I would encourage, again, Mayor Highsmith and his chief of police are in the waiting room. And if it please the chair, I'd like to see them admitted and deliver their testimony.
Okay, real quick, any questions, Mr. Frazier and the Wyoming Association of Municipalities before we get to some local elected officials? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Let me just make sure no one else in the room right now wants to testify in this bill. Okay, not seeing any. We're going to run to the waiting room. And committee, you can all see me I need to get glasses apparently to see that screen. Mr. Rohrbacher, we're going to admit you in.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, thanks for allowing me to be able to speak. My name is Brian Rohrbacher. I'm president and CEO of Atlantic City Federal Credit Union. And I'm sorry that I don't know all of your names, but as one of the committee members had talked about, as if it's a turf war or not. It definitely does seem to be a turf war. And I hate to see it going this way, because what it's doing is it's hurting the town of Shoshone and Wright. A little bit of background, what the Wyoming Bankers Association president was talking about was credit unions don't have the Community Reinvestment Act. We don't need to give back to our communities because Congress believes that we do a great job of doing that on our own without having to need to have governance or legislation to be able to do that. But the Wyoming credit unions we serve over about 300,000 members in the state of Wyoming, and 50% of the credit unions still continue to serve underserved populations. And we have about $145 million in small business loans in 2019, which contributes to about $312 million to the Wyoming economy. During the PPP loans, the Atlantic City Federal Credit Union did participate in the PPP loans. We went through and was working even with the smaller Main Street businesses that was kind of hard for the banks to kind of reach out to, and we just tried to help anybody that we could. So we helped them the best that we could, and I believe that we all worked together to get this done. All of the credit unions in the state of Wyoming, we contributed based on our trade association of about $27 million in financial benefits to the Wyoming consumer. So upon that, I would like to turn it over for maybe any questions that you guys may have for me directly or the credit union. And anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. Any questions? Not seeing at this time, sir. With that, we'll go to Mr. Highsmith. If you would unmute yourself, we have you in the room twice, so I'm not sure which one to click on. Mr. Highsmith, can you hear us? The floor is yours if you want it.
Can you hear me now?
Certainly can. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to touch on a few things. One, this bill is, specifically important for Shoshone and Wright, Wyoming. That's the two communities this affects. Our typical week, we have our chief of police make deliveries to our bank depository in Riverton 4 to 5 times a week. We're on average, that's conservatively 2 hours a day that's taken our chief of police away from his job to serve and protect the citizens of Shoshone. That I feel is more important than initial or costs. If you figured his wages and mileage on a car, that'd easily be over $15,000 a year. We're putting 10 to 13,000 miles additional on our police vehicle. Besides that, but the big issue is safety, and we're without our chief of police for that time. We felt the necessity of delivering our cash every day to the bank, our deposits. We have a lot of checks, cash, a combination, everything. And we actually felt it's important that we do deliver it daily. This is, like I said, those are, I think, real conservative numbers, the mileage and the money, but more importantly, it's the safety, I think, is a very important factor that we're forced to. Well, we have a facility right literally next to a town hall that we could walk over and make that deposit. I would just like to touch base on one of the things that was actually brought up, reinvestment into the community. We do not have a bank here in Shoshone. We have actually had difficulty from landowners, people trying to purchase homes, business owners that find the banks in the surrounding communities a little reluctant to lend money in our community. And I've had people come to me and made that complaint. I have complained, brought that up to at least 2 banks in Riverton that I bank with, that I thought that was an issue, and I would ask for some explanation. But for whatever reason, that's an issue for us. Keep in mind, this bill is for Shoshone, Wyoming. It's for Wright, Wyoming. It's not for Cheyenne. It's not for Riverton. It's not for Casper. That doesn't need this, but it is for us, and we do need this. And like I said, it could have struck a nerve and I know banks probably, well, not probably, they do reinvest in the community they're in, but we don't have one in our community, and we're actually, that's an issue. They are not as easy to work with as if they were local.
All right, can we ask you some questions at this point, Mr. Highsmith?
I want to keep it short. I'd like Chris, who delivers, he's our chief of police and also town clerk, but he delivers our monies daily to the banks in Riverton. But Mr. Chairman, I just like to emphasize, this bill is for Shoshone, Wyoming, and Wright, Wyoming, and this is by not having the ability to deposit locally is causes us problems.
So,
And I
Mr.
sure
Highsmith,
appreciate everybody for listening to me. Thank you.
thanks. I just want to make sure I understand your testimony here. You're telling me your chief of police, who is paid for by the taxpayers, is delivering money on behalf of a private credit union on taxpayer money to Riverton every day? Is that true? That's not what he said. Your chief of police does not deliver the money to the bank.
It's not credit union money, it's public money.
It's public money. Got it. Delivers to a bank, not on behalf of credit. Okay, got it. I'm with you. It took me a second. Mr. Kanija, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As Mayor Highsmith pointed out, as chief of police, as well as the town clerk / treasurer, I'm kind of intertwined in this a little bit more than otherwise, I guess, on both fronts. As far as the chief of police, I try to maintain coverage in town, but there's sometimes with our depositors that we need to transfer the money into our accounts for our bills. And so that leaves the town with no law enforcement available. And I try to time that when I actually have another officer on so it doesn't conflict with that. But sometimes the necessity arises where I have to make a trip to get the deposit in. And the biggest problem is we have a lot of cash that we deal with. It's not just checks, and we don't have a lot of electronic checks. They're all money orders, cashier checks, and the like. And so having a member of my staff take it is a little uncomforting when we're talking $40,000 in cash sometimes that they would have with them. And so that's why the chief of police or a member of the police department takes a deposit in. As far as the treasurer's side, the town of Shoshone has a good working relationship with our bank in Riverton, as well as the personnel that work in the local credit union. And I would personally continue that relationship with the main banking partners in Riverton as the resources available for us to be able to conduct business is already set up through them. It's already recognized throughout all of our vendors that we utilize. However, if I can deposit checks and cash locally, that would free up many hours of my work week, as well as working on not just the clerk side and the treasurer side, but also as a chief of police. And even if I transferred the money electronically from a federal credit union to our main bank in Riverton, that would facilitate the transfer of funds without having to drive back and forth multiple times per week. And as Mayor Highsmith alluded to, there's some weeks it's 3 to 4 times a week, and over the course of a year, that's potentially thousands of dollars that we have to spend on top of taking me out of the community and the issues that present. I can't tell you how many times just by driving down there, people come in and speak with me and I'm out of town when they expect me to be in, which also causes further problems for us in Shoshone. And I think it's kind of unique where we're at and the layout of the land that we have compared to many other communities in the state. And so that's why I believe it's unique to Shoshone and Wright as well. And it just happens to be, that's just how it is. The banking investment back in the town, I agree that the bank that we have as the center of our town is the local credit union. We don't have any other banks that advertise in our town that could commit resources to our town that reinvest in our town because they're not in our town. So I don't believe that that is a issue here constitutionally. I can't speak to, but as far as this bill goes, that's why I'm in support of it and speaking today. Thank you.
Okay, let me ask you a couple questions. I mean, I think I was confused. You're the town clerk and the town chief of police?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Got it. Second, and I'm going to phrase this delicately. If you're transporting 40,000 a day to Riverton, have you ever discussed the possibility of your bank either opening a satellite office or your bank sending someone to your community to pick up the funds? I would just think that amount of money on a semi-regular basis would necessitate a conversation with your bank to come visit you more often instead of you driving the money in. Has that conversation occurred?
Mr. Chairman, I've never actually asked that question if they could come be a courier and pick up the money themselves. And it's not daily, it's up to occasionally. We've had that depending on just how the weeks go with cash deposits that come into the town. But I've never actually asked them specifically if they could have a courier service that we could utilize.
Representative Clausen, question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, so I want to get this straight too. So you can't deposit your cash into the credit union under current statute and then wire it to your bank either. That's not allowed.
Mr. Knaja, would that be correct?
Correct.
Okay. Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Anyone else in the online waiting room that wishes to testify? Ms. Spillman, did the treasurer's office have comments? Or I didn't call on you because I thought you were just here for information, but if the state treasurer does have comments, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the rest of the committee. My name is Lisa Jordy Spillman. I'm General Counsel for the Wyoming State Treasurer's Office. The treasurer isn't taking a position with respect to credit unions. What we have some concerns with is some potential unintended consequences stemming from the language. Under 94801, the State Loan and Investment Board sits as the Board of Deposits. And so the state treasurer is the secretary of that board. And it's his job under 94802, when the banks want to apply to be a state depository, they submit applications, they submit board resolutions, the state treasurer reviews that and makes recommendations to the State Board of Deposits. Under 94803, that outlines where that the state treasurer can deposit money in national banks and in Wyoming banks and outstate banks that do business in Wyoming. So, and under 94817, where there's changes proposed here, both to 94803 and 94817, that's where the local political subdivisions can set forth for their banks to be approved. Those banks have to have been approved under 94803A. And 94803A is where the State Board of Deposits, those are the banks the State Board of Deposits approves. So the changes to 94803A and 94817, I think have some unintended consequences that create. So right now, under 94803A, the SLIB board approves under 94801 through 94803, SLIB board approves the banks, and in this additional language in the changes to 94803, it says at the very bottom of the changes that they can be the banks can be institutions approved by the Board of Deposits as kind of the final bank that can be approved by those local government bodies, and that's quite different than the way the process is now. And the second concern that we have is in that broad definition that's added to the bottom of 94803, it doesn't say the language about outstate banks that is incorporated earlier. And there are an awfully lot of, there's state money in outstate banks in various towns and cities. And we're kind of concerned that this creates a hurdle for this 10-mile radius, creates a hurdle for cities, towns, and counties that doesn't currently exist in the law in order for them to deposit in outstate chartered banks. So we would just request maybe that the language, if the intent is to permit deposits in credit unions, that the language be reviewed so there's no unintended consequences on the State Board of Deposits in terms of various lists that it might have to make, and on these local governments that want to deposit in out of state banks, just to make sure that under this change in the law, they still can.
So I just want to make sure I understand your testimony, Ms. Spillman. Would it be, are you advocating to remove the 10-mile radius altogether and just say when practicable? Would that make your life easier?
You know,
How do I address the concerns, I guess, is my question ultimately. Is there a statutory change or a wording fix that would make this palatable?
it seems to me a few years back, I saw some changes proposed to add credit unions, and it wasn't in this capacity. And I'm not sure that our office had the same concerns back then. Adding it as this separate section, it's just, there's a whole lot of language and we're quite concerned about the ramifications. I'm not exactly sure how to change it. We weren't exactly sure that it was even related to the credit union issue. In fact, since credit union isn't defined anywhere in the changes.
It's very fair. Questions for Ms. Spillman or the Treasurer's Office? Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I didn't want to bring this up, but since you brought it up, I'll ask you the question. So looking at 94803, where it defines bank to include federal and state savings and loan associations, that was my first question, is why do we need to redefine, why do we need to add a paragraph that defines what's already in the above paragraph? And then my second question is, and this is the problem that we always get into when you get just a portion of the statute with the bill, paragraph B that says the state treasurer may promulgate necessary rules and regulations for the implementation of approved state depository and time deposits, open account programs. Does the treasurer have the rulemaking authority to go ahead and accomplish what's being asked for in this bill? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Spillman, if you know.
Thank you. I hadn't thought about, Mr. Chairman, I hadn't thought about rulemaking. I'm not sure that there's rulemaking called for us in here. I need to think about whether or not there's an impact on TDOA. Now that's all state recipients, and this is specifically with respect to local governments. So I don't believe there would be any rulemaking that would be necessitated by our office unless there's something that this committee sees differently.
Good. Further questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Ms. Spillman. Sorry I didn't call on you earlier. I just thought you might be there for questions. All right, anyone else wish to testify on House Bill 65? Seeing none, before I ask for committee pleasure, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I was a little confused at the Treasurer's Office concerns on the non-state banks, because I thought we cleared that up with House Bill 28 in 2017 that allows for the deposit of public funds in non-state banks. That was an issue that was identified when we brought this around the first time. So I think that we have that cleared up to where public funds can be deposited in non-state banks. And then, Mr. Chairman, I'd kind of like to go back to Mr. Meyer's comments on the Constitution use of the language practicality and his point in concern on lack of definition on what practicality is. And I think that that may be a fair comment. And I think that that's what we try to do in this language, which defines practicality now as within a 10-mile radius. And so we try to add some clarification to that to say, is it practical to drive within 10 miles to find a bank? And to his point, he says, if you look at Cheyenne, that's from one end of the town to the other. So if I were in Cheyenne and drove from one end of town to the other, how many banks would I find? Multiple, I think. But if we were in Shoshone and we went 10 miles any direction, one is hedge out into the Gas Hills and the other to Shoshone, you don't find anything. And so I think that this really comes back to kind of give a little more definition to that practicality issue that's there. I'm happy to reach out, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little confused. That shouldn't surprise any of you. I'm a little confused at some of the concerns that I'm hearing from the treasurer's office with the ability, because these are institutions that are approved already by the Board of Deposits. And so I'm not sure, but I would like, I'm happy to reach out to them with LSO staff that drafted this to make sure that we don't have something in conflict and have something ready if we think that there is conflict to bring as amendment, because I do want to make sure that we've got this clean and previously we had felt that it was. So I just thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Representative. Okay, committee, what's your pleasure on House Bill
Mr. Chairman,
65?
I do apologize for the interruption, but you have one more person in the waiting room who would like to testify.
Well, where do they come from?
I would be happy to let them in if you'd like.
Sure, I can let them in. Third time, so I should have called 3 times for public comment. All right, hey, Gary, welcome to the Corporations Committee. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that. I'll make this real quick, and I appreciate all the conversation. Gary Michaud here. I'm the administrator for the Fremont County Association of Governments, which represents the 6 municipalities in the county here in Fremont County. And I just want to let the committee know that all the entities in our board voted in favor unanimously for this. And this is just a head scratcher. I don't understand. I'll make this quick. I just don't understand why the banks are fighting this. If they wanted a bank in Shoshone, they should just put one. Otherwise, let's go ahead and let the town work with the credit union. And so, and you guys can tell by listening to the chief / clerk / treasurer for the town that they have very limited resources and personnel, and so struggling, and they could use any bit of help they can get. So we fully support this, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Questions, committee? Seeing none. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hope you're enjoying Fremont County since you left us here in this lovely community. Committee, what is your pleasure on House Bill 65, moved by Blackburn, seconded by Duncan? Any discussion or amendments, committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Duncan.
Yes, I would like to move proposed amendment by Chairman Zwanitzer.
So committee, I did pass out, well, let me give a copy to, can you pass it down to the clerk or to give to Representative Larson so he has a copy? There is an amendment in front of you if we wanted to
Representative
allow
Larson.
federal credit unions to be public depositories,
Representative Larson.
which is what Representative Duncan is moving at this time. Let me ask for a second before we proceed down there, if there's a second.
That's why they.
I'm not hearing a second, Representative Duncan. I certainly like the amendment, but I'm also very cognizant that Representative Larson would really love to get this bill passed this year.
I'll second.
Seconded by McGuire. Okay.
Jojo.
Do you want to talk about the amendment? I'd be happy to explain.
I would love for the chairman to.
Well, so committee, the amendment in front of you adds national chartered credit unions. As was testified, we don't have state chartered credit unions in Wyoming. I just say 25 states allow for credit unions to be public depositories. This would affect, I don't know, 500 special districts around the state. And I've been around for 12 years. We've had this kind of controversy. And I guess I'll just be honest. I understand that banks do pay the taxes, but I also understand that gives them a higher overhead. And I come down to the place that says, what's in the best interest of taxpayers? And if credit unions can give a better rate to public money than a bank can, and I know there's a whole bunch of other federal laws and things that complicate that, I'm very well aware. But it just comes down to me, that's where it comes down is, we should be able to shop for the best rate. And I understand the federal government's not as friendly to banks on putting taxes and other regulations on them that credit unions don't have. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's public funds and they should be able to shop around to try to get the best rate for their constituents. So that's where I come down on the fight. But I do want to reemphasize that I don't want to kill this bill on Representative Larson or the town of Shoshone. So discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just
am appalled at the argument that credit unions don't contribute to communities. They do. They are a vital part to the communities just as much as our banks. So it's just a different business model, as you so aptly, as our representative so aptly remarked. So I think if this gives our two particular communities an option, I would love to give all of our communities an option if it helps. So especially in our trying times that we are right now. So that's why I'm all in on this amendment. Thank you.
Further discussion, committee? Seeing no further discussion, all in favor of the amendment proposed, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
Amendment has failed. But I would remind the good Vice Chair of Minerals that she has 48 hours to introduce another bill, should she want. With that, committee, further testimony on House Bill 65.
Question.
And Representative Blackburn, if you turn off your mic when you're not using it. Seeing no further testimony, Barb, if you would call the roll on House Bill 65. I appreciate it.
Representative Blackburn. Representative Clausen. Representative Clifford. Excused. Rep-
Sure, go ahead, and I
Who
think
is
she is
here?
watching, so I'm gonna see if she jumps in the room.
Okay. Representative Duncan.
Aye.
Representative Air.
Aye.
Representative Hunt. Representative McGuire.
No.
Representative Roscoe. Chairman Zwanich.
Aye.
The bill does pass.
Okay, and Representative Larson, you'll be carrying it on the floor. Best of luck. Thank you for coming to corporations today.
Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you very much.
Next up committee will be House Bill 14, Rights of Way Along Public Ways Amendments. With that, it was an interim committee bill, but I assume it came from YDOT or Miss Levin or Mrs. Erga. Miss Levin, you don't want to present this bill to the committee, do you? Do you know where it came from? Broadband Task Force. Were you a member of that? Anybody in the committee room, a member of the Broadband Task Force who wants to present this bill? Anybody on the committee want to talk about the bill in the interim? Representative Duncan, you want to give me the quick background?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This is basically, if I remember right, well, let me look. Was this the bill, committee members, help me out? Was this the bill that allowed broadband to tap on? Ms. Levin, is this the one where that allowed them to tap onto broadband towers? No, that was a different one. I don't remember.
President Clausen, go ahead. I like it. Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, so what this bill does, yeah, I voted against it. I didn't like it, but I'll explain what it does. So if you go to page 3, line 12, what the genesis was to try and when broadband providers were going into communities to, if they didn't get a response for a permit by a certain amount of time, they were automatically approved, which I think is personally is problematic, but anyway. And then there was some problems. Public right of way is pretty questionable that it exists at all, because right of way for highway, right of way for specific uses. Yeah, so I wasn't in love with it, but that's sort of what the.
Okay, so it's a parity for them having to make a decision within 45 days, which allows permitting or denial of public right of way.
Mr. Chairman, but it actually is deemed to have been approved.
If it's not denied, it's automatically approved. Makes sense. Okay, with that committee, you'll remember I scheduled this bill originally and we held it back because several of the telecom companies wanted some time to work on an amendment, which I'm sure we'll hear about as we move forward. So with that, House Bill 14 is our public comment. For or against the bill, Mr. Kennedy? Welcome to corporations.
Association of Conservation Districts, and it was read.
Oh, I just turned it on for you. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Keith County, Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts. We don't have any opinion one way or another on the bill itself, but I would suggest that the timeline is extremely short, especially when we consider that perhaps a county planning and zoning commission, as well as county commissioners, would look at it. It may also go out, it will also go out to various state and local entities, and that timeline is extremely short. I would suggest the 30 days be at least 45 and the 45 days be at least 60 days. And with that, I'd welcome any of your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for the conservation districts? Seeing none. Appreciate it, Mr. Kennedy. And Ms. Zerga, I do see you on Zoom. If you want to go next on any comments or background on the bill, we would be appreciative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Liz Zerga on behalf of the Wyoming Telecommunications Association. So the genesis of this bill was the legislative task force assembled for broadband. And it was part of a very large concept bill that was brought forth by the broadband legislative task force. And then they broke various topics into smaller bills. And it was not this particular bill. There are aspects of it that were certainly generated based on comments from my association as well as other telecom carriers. And so very briefly, just an overview at the high level of the bill. The first part of the bill, the first section does deal with construction permits, licenses, and other authorizations that are needed to construct broadband facilities. It does not deal with franchises, franchises that a municipality or perhaps a county may require. Those are a separate statute, and this particular bill does not have anything to do with those. It only deals with constructions, permits, licenses, and those kinds of authorizations that might otherwise be needed. And what the Broadband Legislative Task Force concluded after input and testimony from carriers was that sometimes these construction permits and licenses get very bogged down, and nothing is heard back and time periods elapse. So what the Legislative Task Force did originally was they had a much shorter time frame, and then the counties and the municipalities came in and requested a longer time frame. And so the Broadband Legislative Task Force said that the cities or the counties needed to respond, just respond within 30 business days. That doesn't mean that that would be the final determination, just simply respond, acknowledging that they have the permit, they're reviewing it. They could approve it or they could deny it within those 30 business days, but they need to respond. And then the Broadband Legislative Task Force determined that 45 business days would be the time period by which they need to either deny or approve the application for the permit or authorization. And if they did not do so, if they didn't do those things, respond within 30 days or approve or deny within 45 business days, then the permit, the license, or the authorization would be deemed to have been issued. So that's the first part of the bill. The second part of the bill is something that my clients were very interested in. We've had a great deal of difficulty getting from federal agencies timely response to requests for permits along the highway department right-of-way. Not the Department of Transportation. They've been very cooperative. We're talking about the necessity to obtain a BLM permit or another federal permit even though it's in the highway right of way. And so what the latter portion of this bill does is it asks YDOT to seek approval from the federal government for a blanket license or permit or right of way for broadband providers to set their fixtures and facilities along, across, or under any public roads located on or through federal lands. And then it has additional provisions regarding transmitting that notion to the federal congressional delegation, and also to convene a working group to address this issue. That latter issue is a big issue. We have permits that have been held up by the federal government in highway right-of-way for more than a year, more than 2 years. And so it has really, in certain instances, deterred the ability to get broadband where we need to get it. So that's the summary of the bill. And I believe Ms. Levin has an amendment that I worked with her on. But my clients support this bill as it came out of the Broadband Legislative Task Force, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Questions from Ms. Durgan, the Telecommunications Association. Representative McGuire, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with regard to the second portion of your testimony, one of the questions that I had is, and I can certainly understand where the agencies that are in charge of our highways and roads would take their time in order to whether or not they would want to approve a tower, because that's not what the highway right-of-ways were there for. They're not there for towers and communication towers. They are there for the transportation infrastructure. And the towers are, for different reasons, whether it be the view shed or whether it be safety of aviation or other things, the towers are a concern. And I guess the question that I would have is whether or not this bill is putting the government into a position where the government is competing with private entity. Typically, don't the telecommunication companies go first to a commercial tower and try to rent space or build a tower or cooperate with another entity that's building a tower and do that on private land? And if we sort of bull rush this through, isn't that putting the state in a position where they, by necessity, have to compete with private enterprise? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Zerga, if you'd like to respond.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, first of all, a little bit of clarification, and maybe it's the wording on page 4 with respect to towers that is drawing your attention. I'm not sure. But basically what that says is that the first section of the bill won't apply to towers. So the first section of this bill won't apply to towers. The second portion of the bill that I talked about with respect to highway right-of-way, we're not talking about towers there for a blanket easement. We're talking about typically underground fiber facilities that are running parallel to the highway in the right-of-way easement. And what happens nowadays is a lot of telecommunications and broadband providers do utilize that YDOT highway right-of-way to put longitudinal fiber facilities underground. And what's holding them up is permitting from the federal government when the highway crosses BLM land. And so that's what we're talking about with respect to the second part. I know it doesn't exactly specify what kind of broadband facilities in that second part, but that's what we're talking about. As far as I know, no one is advocating that any kind of tower be placed in the highway right-of-way. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Other questions, Ms. Zerga? Seeing none. Thank you, Liz. Director Reiner and Mr. Gillette, whoever wants to testify on behalf of YDOT, please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Luke Reiner, Director of YDOT.
Let me just say, certainly we are involved in this task force throughout the process, and what Ms. Zerga and others have said about this bill is true. We have no issue with the timelines prescribed in the first section, the 30 days and 45 days. To the best of our knowledge, we meet those, and we're certainly fine with those timelines. If you flip over the page to page 4, item C, line 4 on page 4, it talks about nothing in this section shall authorize communication companies to set or install permanent towers along, across, and you can read what it says. Thank you for that language. Protection of right-of-way, very important to us. There has been talk about, hey, well, if we can't put towers up, can we put poles up? And would respectively ask that poles also not be included in right-of-way. And if you know, would go to the extent of requesting an amendment to say, you know, nothing in this section shall authorize communications to set up, you know, permanent towers or poles. For us, it becomes a safety issue. It's another obstacle in the right of way that people can spin off and hit. And certainly for us, the added difficulties become typically if you're talking a communications, you know, pole or tower, there's some sort of communications apparatus on it, and people will be in and out of the right of way trying to work on that. So that would be really, that has come up really post the approval of this bill. And so is one concern that we would currently have. We fully support this state's initiative to expand broadband. And really, as Ms. Zerga indicated, I think we have a really good working relationship with the companies that put in fiber. Our office works closely with them on a daily basis. Certainly, we have a policy that says, hey, let's dig once, so that we're in and out of that right away as least as we can, and that's for the traveling public safety. And so I think we're heading in the right direction. The comment about renting space on towers was dealt with in House Bill 15, which was another segment of the working group's output, and that is progressing through you know, this body as we speak. In terms of section 2 and 3, certainly we'll comply with that guidance. I do understand the frustration. You know, we deal with it on a daily basis. I would share with this body, I suspect that, you know, right now we're actually under a 60-day moratorium on doing nothing in the right of way as part of the change in administration. You know, while it really came out in the same order as the oil and gas information. Now that will come to an end here pretty soon, but we've actually been negatively affected, you know, in terms of progressing some of our contract that guidance. But we'll make that work. Mr. Chairman, that would be a quick summary of YDOT's position. Let's just see if Mr. Babbitt or Mr. Gillette has anything to add, with your permission, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Mr. Babbitt appears to. Go ahead, Mr. Babbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Troy Babbitt, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at YDOT. And I would just reiterate exactly what the director said there. Controlled access in the right-of-way is our concern for our safety for our folks. And over the past year, we have had conversations with Ms. Zerga, and we do work very well with ISPs in getting those conduits installed and expanding fiber. So we do have a shared resource agreement to try and expand broadband across. So I think the director addressed the majority of the concerns. So thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Babbitt. Mr. Gillette, if you've got anything, and then we'll just stand for YDOT all for questions.
I like it. Mr. Gillette, anything to add?
Mr. Chairman, Mark Gillette with YDOT. No, I'm here just in support of the director and Troy with any questions.
Questions for YDOT, Representative Clausen, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and anybody from YDOT to answer this, but when you have right of way that's specifically purchased for highways, are you even allowed to add communication devices? And then when you do like a reroute or a reconstruction, who pays for the moving of the cable or the fiber? Two-part question, I guess.
Sure. Mr. Babbitt, if you know.
Mr. Chairman, in recent years, we have been able to expand broadband into the right of way. Certainly a concern is that it's getting awfully crowded with the majority of a lot of different utilities that we actually put in there. The shared resource agreement does address that it is up to the ISPs if in fact roadway has to be reconstructed in the movement change of those paths.
Cool. Further questions for YDOT? Seeing none, thank you, Director.
Thank
Up
you, Mr.
next,
Chairman.
Ms. Levin. Welcome to Corporations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jody Levin here on behalf of Charter Communications. At the outset, I want to say thank you to Chairman Swanitzer and the committee for holding House Bill 14 back from your last round of committee hearings. It enabled Ms. Zerga and I to get together and work out language, which I will discuss momentarily, but we do appreciate that accommodation. Charter had been an active participant before the Broadband Task Force over the interim. Heading into the November committee meeting, Charter was opposed to this bill, not because of the work with local governments. Operations tells me that they have no problems operationally getting their permits approved. Their concern was on page 3, subsection B, the definition of communications company. As I had emailed the committee, definitions in this world are extremely important. Charter is not a communications company, it is a cable company. I know sometimes this looks like we're splitting hairs, but this really is important in the context of federal regulation and where their authority comes from. The language you see in red underline on lines 18 and 19, again, I'm on page 3, subsection B. This was added in the November committee meeting as placeholder language to ensure that Charter was eligible to participate under this bill. So heading into that meeting, because of the way this subsection was defined, Charter's concern was they wouldn't be able to utilize this language, and they really felt like we had a parity problem. The committee was kind enough to add that language in and said, if we didn't get it right, come back to us with language. That's what I attempted to do ahead of the last committee meeting when this issue was scheduled. But the way I had drafted that language raised a concern from the other industry providers, not in trying to clarify the definition of cable operator and communications company, but in the context of saying that where I had placed it in this bill, it was then creating an unfair situation where Charter was going to be able to get access to the right of way and not have to offer similar services and have similar requirements. So Ms. Zerga was kind enough to work with me to find a compromise. That compromise now, again, page 3, subsection B, would be striking the language that you see underlined in red on lines 18 and 19. And at the bottom of line 22, you would insert then for purposes of section 126.813 only, and notwithstanding any other provision of law, a communications company includes a cable operator as defined in 47 USC 522.5, provided the cable operator provides any of the services listed in this subsection. So that addresses Charter's concern over how it is defined in order to access the right of way. And it addresses the concerns of Ms. Zerga's clients that everyone have equal access, but also equal service requirements. I know it's a little convoluted and it does feel like it is splitting hairs, but the legal department at Charter tells me they are in court constantly over this definition of communications company versus cable operator. Mr. Chairman, I did email the committee and I have emailed this language to LSO as well. I'd ask for your favorable consideration and stand for questions.
Any questions, Ms. Levin? Not seeing any, Jody. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further public comment from Mr. Reeman? Welcome. And it sounds like we might have Mr. Willix as well on Zoom. So I'm just going to bring him in so he hears your testimony as well. All right, go ahead, Mr. Reeman.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Reeman here on behalf of Wyoming's County Commissioners. Our board president is here as well, Mr. Jim Willix, and he'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. I want to emphasize that my members do support broadband development across the state and have taken a number of actions themselves to try and advance that. And we've worked very well with the members of that industry. I actually have a commissioner that sits on that broadband task force that has been working on these issues. In fact, she's been chairman of many of the committee work to date. In fact, beyond that, she has been appointed to our National Association of County Organizations broadband task force, one of 25 members across the country that's working on these issues. My members did identify a couple of issues during the interim, and I do appreciate that the Corporations Committee did work to address those, but my members still remain very concerned, in particular about the second part of the timeline, that 45-day timeline. As you can imagine, most or quite a few of my members are in the farming and ranching industry, much like your body, and many of them expressed that it takes them in the private sector more than 90 days typically to negotiate some sort of a right-of-way agreement to proceed. So putting this to county staff to adhere to something much stronger is certainly problematic, and frankly may end up with more denials of permits than we all want to see happen. And you know, I'll be honest, so far, nobody in industry has suggested to me or in the conversation that counties in particular haven't been responsive to these things. So we would ask that 45 days be extended perhaps to 90 days, such as that private sector experience. Mr. Chairman, I think the most problematic part of this bill is on page 3, lines 9 through 14. And that is the assumption that if we can't give you a denial or approval, you can go do whatever you want to in the right of way. And let's just assume that we have something slip up administratively through the process, through no fault of anybody's, and we don't do that. We have just given a company blanket authority to go do whatever they want to in the right of way, which may jeopardize public infrastructure and private infrastructure. And that's simply something my members aren't acceptable to. And so we would ask that that language, starting with any on line 9 through the balance of page 4, or sorry, line 14 be stricken from the bill. If we can get some changes, I think we can move from our position of being strongly opposed to this bill into a more favorable place relative to it. Again, we want to see broadband developed across this state. It will help my members. It will help all of our communities, and we want to do our part with that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions.
How about if we turn it over to Mr. Willix as well, and then questions for either one of you? Afternoon, Jim. Floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, Jim Willix, President of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association and a Converse County Commissioner. I think Jeremiah covered everything. The one thing I do want to add is this puts broadband in a category separate from other utilities that use our right-of-way, with that presumption in there that they can be approved. And I don't think that's good policy and is not good practice to create a presumption of approval. Again, with the timeline changed, I believe we would be supportive of expanding this, but that timeline and the presumption give us a lot of heartburn. Many counties work on a very small staff, And some counties only meet once a month. And so you fit that 45-day timeline in there, could make it very difficult to reach that conclusion. With more time, I think we could give more favorable answers and get it done right. But absolutely, the presumption is something we stand very strongly against, and would stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Just an initial question, I guess, maybe to you, Mr. Riemann. Why, if you can't approve it within, let's say, 45 days, would you not just issue a denial? They would have to do an entire new permit process and it would just be burdensome? I think the burden of proof is on accepting. Otherwise, you just deny it if you're not ready to do it, and they would come back and submit another application, but that's not enough.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're right. You could go the route of denial and force it back through the process. But I don't know that that's what my members want to do. I think they want to get to permits, and that denial is just one more part of the equation and perhaps lengthening the process here unnecessarily.
Okay. Further questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Wilks. Mr. Riemann. Any other people wish to testify in this bill? Wham, welcome. I know we have about 6 minutes, so it gives you about 2 there, Mr. Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I do know that you're essentially out of time. I just want to echo our support for what the County Commissioners Association just indicated. We did have some concerns that we voiced to the in the interim to the task force, and they were pretty responsive in addressing those. I think Mr. Willicks, I was going to share a real life example with you, but Mr. Willicks, I think, did that, and without getting into too much detail, unless you've got a question about it, I think with one of our larger communities, much like YDOT, who indicated they wouldn't have a problem with the timelines. In our larger communities, the same thing is true. We've got engineers on staff. A lot of those decisions are actually executable by staff, and so quick turnarounds aren't that big a deal. But if you have a small community that doesn't have an engineer on staff, rarely deals with this, has to find someone to vet it for them and go through the time to be vetted. In the meantime, they only meet once a month. And in the event that you've missed, by the time you took a few weeks to get that information back, you've missed the notice deadline, and that pushes you out. So anyway, again, I do appreciate what the committee did in the interim. And I think that 45 days was in recognition of that, but I think there may be some cases even in which that will be tight for some of our smaller communities. So I just would echo that, and also echo what Ms. Zerga said, that it's important that this does have language that indicates that it's separate from the franchise agreement process, and I think it's important that language remain, and I appreciate the industry recognizing that. And with that, I would certainly be redundant of what else has been said if I continued, and I think I might be inside my 2 minutes, so I'll take questions.
Great questions, Mr. Frazier. Seeing none, thank you very much. Further committee testimony, Mr. Moline.
Mr. Chairman, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. The question just came to my mind. In many times, the Department of Transportation owns the land that the road is on. So I could see how this easement would work. This bill would work. But what about where it is just an easement and the landowner still owns the land, but the highway department has the highway? I don't know the answer to that, and I wasn't in on the task force, but I just a question on that. How does that work when the landowner owns the land and YDOT doesn't? With that, Mr. Chairman, I would sit for any questions.
Questions for the Farm Bureau? Seeing none.
Thank you.
Certainly we'll have that question out there, and I imagine people will look into it. All right, any further public comment? With that, we'll close public comment committee. What's your pleasure on House Bill 14?
Make a motion to table this till next meeting. Do we have time?
I hope so. Ms. Representative Duncan moved it before you tabled it, so If we need further, okay, well, the motion to table is on the floor, which is not debatable. So all in favor of tabling the bill till what, indefinitely or till next meeting? What, till the motion is to table till our next meeting. All those in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Okay, we will hold House Bill 14 to Wednesday at lunch. We'll make it first thing. If there are any amendments, certainly let us know. Committee, we've now had 2 meetings where we have not gotten to House Bill 72. I do know there is a lot of thought on both sides of that bill on if it's ready for prime time and we can support it through the process. So I'll keep talking with the sponsor to see if he can get some amendments or something ready to go to make it easy, as well as people who have concerns about the bill. So we may or may not hear 72 on Wednesday. I may just push it in the interim because it's looking like questions are mounting that have no answers currently. So with that, Wednesday noon, thank you all.